And then we made our first trip up to Alaska in 2013. And my husband was getting interested in it, but wasn't as passionate about it until after the trip. So we wrote our first book, We Fought the Road, and that is a memoir to my dad and the 93rd Engineers. And then we came up on the 2017 and we looked at Valdez in the 97th. We did not get a chance to go up there before. And the 97th was fascinating and talking to a lot of people at the museum in Valdez, and then Molly Good at the library, and several other people along the route of the 97th. But the 97th was fascinating when we learned that 10 men were court-martialed for mutiny. And this is highly unusual because this was not a combat zone. This was a project that was being done. So those who've read A Different Race, it includes the court-martial. It lasted over 3 days, 4 days, and there was 400 pages. So we had to make it smaller to fit into the book. But the Alaska Highway started back in the 1930s, and many people wanted to have a land route from the States all the way up to Delta, Alaska, and maybe Fairbanks. And there were a couple outposts. There were soldiers at Chilcoot Barracks, and there was also about 200 soldiers at Fort Richardson and Anchorage before Buckner came. And it was a very long, drawn-out process for these gentlemen to make a decision as to where the road was going to go. And finally, when Pearl Harbor occurred, and the Japanese islands were like 600, the Paramashiro was like 650 miles from Attu. They really got worried whether the Japanese could essentially walk across the Aleutians and come to the States, which obviously they can't, but they did not know. And they pushed it through, the military pushed it through to build the highway, where Canada was building their airfields, because Canada and Britain and France were in the war very early on. So that's how they decided. They called it the Northwest Staging Route. So, and there were 4 white regiments and 3 black regiments. And Sturtevant sent General Hogue in February, I think it was Valentine's Day, to Dawson Creek to scope things out. And he flew in the plane with Les Cook, looked at the geographical things. They didn't have any maps back then. He called the maps they had where he said they think they got them from National Geographic. But he realized right away that 4 white engineering regiments would not be enough. So he asked Sturtevant for 3 more. And Sturtevant told him that the 3 would have to be black. And Buckner, who took over Fort Richardson in 1940, did not care for black soldiers and thought they would intermingle with the First Nations and produce a race of mongrels. And he told Sturtevant they can come, but they have to stay away from the locals and the towns. But 7 regiments came up, and the first regiment landed in March of 42. That was 35th, the 340th. Let me get these. I always forget dates. So the 18th Regiment was a white regiment, and they came in through Skagway and went to Whitehorse, and they arrived April 7th. The 93rd, my dad's regiment, arrived on April 14th. They also came through Skagway, and that was a black regiment. So you had the 18th who went through Skagway very quickly, but the 93rd and then 340th, another white regiment, landed in Skagway. So you had approximately 3,400 military people, half black, in a little town of 640 people, Skagway. It was a city, excuse me. And so General Hogue, who was then commander of the project, said, let's get the blacks out. So he moved the black 93rd out to Carcross as soon as possible. And the 340th stayed in Skagway 6 weeks before they started on their portion of the road. So back south, we had the 35th that came in March, and they had to get to Fort Nelson over the Peace River by Easter. And then the 341st came, gotta think of it, sometime 18th, 93rd, 341st. I can't remember. They came in April. And then the 97th Black Regiment came in May. And it was April 14th or April 17th, the Charlie Lake incident occurred with the 341st, where 17 of the soldiers, 12 of them died from drowning. And there were 5 that were rescued by Gus Hayden. And then the Black Regiment came. And their 95th Regiment came in May. All of the Black regiments, except for the 97th, had to bivouac separate from the white regiments. There had to be a double system. So you had to have 2 sets of latrines, two mess halls, 2 sets of tents, things like that, and a road in between. And my dad mentioned the road in between was called the Negro Road. So the 97th arrived at Valdez the end of April to about a foot of snow, and these Black soldiers have never seen any snow. But were very, very cold, but they came in through the town, and then they had to march 19 miles out toward Wortman's, which had a roadhouse, to get out of the town and not be near any of the locals. And they couldn't start on their end of the highway until the avalanche was cleared. And the pass, Thompson's Pass, was cleared as well. So that's when they all arrived, and they all had similar stories of what they put up with. So I'm going to ask some questions here. Does anybody have any stories they've heard about the Alaska Highway and how it was built? Do they have any family members that were with the Alaska Highway? I don't hear it.
Go ahead and speak up if anybody has comments.
Well, this is Joan, and my husband arrived here by himself, not with me, at the end of the building of the Alaska Highway. He did not do that. He worked for the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Okay. So did he have any contact with some of the civilian contractors that were part of the highway as well?
I don't know, because I didn't come up until about 6 months later. He came up in December. And his choice was either to come and work for this company in Alaska or go to Iran. And I, as his wife, would not go to Iran.
I don't blame you.
Women may figure that one out even now.
Have you read any of my books? Who besides Lynn, who else may have read some of the books?
You have 2 on right now, Chris. Mary has and Sherry has.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So do you have any questions? I would love to engage in questions rather than me sitting here and arbitrarily decide what I'm going to tell you, because there's so much information.
Your mute is on.
No.
Okay.
Sherry? No, mine, you mean, Sherry?
Oh, Mary's. She was talking.
Mine says,
Oh,
Yeah, it's on now. We can hear you.
you can hear me now?
thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mary.
Thank you. Well, I read the different race. I just thought it was a fascinating read, Christine, and it's such a interesting part of our history, and that most of us don't know. I drove the highway when I came to Alaska in 1966, the Alaska Highway, and the Canadian part, of course, wasn't paved, but I do remember hearing maybe on that trip that the original parts of the road were built in the corduroy, and I think there was one place where you could actually see the logs stacked in the way that made the corduroy road. So that was interesting to me. But I think what was also interesting to me is how you did so much great research, and you don't live in Alaska. You came here for a trip. I was looking to see if your sources included our libraries, and it seemed like you did most of your research from the families of the guys that were there. So I was sort of interested in that part.
Well, most of the research where we got the regimental histories was in St. Louis, the National Archives there. And we also got the rosters of the men. So I had all of the names. So on the website, Ordinary Men Build Legendary Road, I have put in the 93rd and the 97th men from the rosters, and I've looked them up in Ancestry, newspapers and things like that. And they're all listed there. I'm in the process of finishing the 95th. I got waylaid. And the whole purpose of that, I'm learning where they were from and what parts of the country they were living in. For instance, in 93rd, most of the men came from New Orleans and Georgia, and some from South Carolina. And then the 97th was mostly Georgia, North and South Carolina, and a few of them came from Philadelphia and New York. So when we started researching the 97th, we had already done the preliminary steps. We traveled up there. We talked to Lael Morgan, who helped us a lot with her history and things. And we took all the records out of the Polar collection, University of Fairbanks, that she had done as well. We got a lot of information. And of course, you walk around and you talk to people, or you Ann Haycock in Dawson Creek. I think I spent 4 hours there just talking to her about Alaska Highway, the men there, and the impact they had on the First Nations in that area, the town, the explosion that occurred in Dawson Creek, and how the Army had to rebuild that. And then when I got to Fort St. John, I spent a lot of time there at Fort St. John Museum, talking about Charlie Lake, what had happened, and going out to the memorial there. And then we had a group that met at the museum, and some had memories of where the Blacks were camped and some things and stories that they had at the same time. They're just little bits or snippets, if you will, or pieces of gold that you find that I usually would go down a rabbit hole to find more information about that. I think I bought every used book about the Alaska Highway and diaries of the civilian contractors, the truckers, and just anything I could get my hands on. Valdez was great. Molly is part of the library system there, and she has a great collection of information about Alaska and the earthquake, but also the highway. And also there's another gentleman, I can't remember his name, has a museum. And what's interesting about Valdez, when we first went up there, they told me and my husband, Major Banks, there was a Black soldier that was buried in their cemetery. So I researched that, and I pulled his records from St. Louis National Archives. And yes, Major Banks was buried there, but he had been relocated or disinterred to Fort Richardson, and they did not know that. So they had spent a lot of money and time trying to locate this gentleman's grave. And so with all the papers and everything, I was able to help them realize that he wasn't there anymore. And in 1948, Major Banks went back to his family in Danville, Virginia. So there's just wasn't one way that my husband and I researched. I was a better researcher. He was a better writer, and we argued a lot in writing both of these books. But it's just, especially with a different race, he did most of the writing for a different race because we had to do it that way, because I had to figure out, okay, this has to be in this section and the context, and what was how did they figure by court-martialing 10 men for mutiny would help quell the freedom that Colonel Robinson gave the men. When Whipple took the original regiment to Fairbanks, he was a micromanager. He did not know how to delegate. And then he had one major, and I won't mention his name, that literally drove 200 miles back to come down to Valdez for a steak dinner and a bath, while the rest of the regiment, his battalion, were up in the mountains, and they had no leadership. The blacks had no leadership at all. They didn't know what to do, where to do it. And in that book, it gives you some idea, because when they fired Whipple and hired Robinson, Robinson sent out a memo to his group, and including the officers. And the memo is just fascinating, because he saw soldiers sleeping over the Jeep steering wheel and not paying attention to the construction. And he saw equipment being deadlined or destroyed that didn't need to be, and poor construction techniques, such as, corduroying that should have been done, or drainage ditches that should have been done on the side so that it wouldn't travel through the mud. So we found all of that information from Walter Parsons, Captain Walter Parsons' son, and how we found him through a Facebook page where we found his granddaughter. And then we went out to Eastern Maryland and spent 2 weeks at a local campground. We have a truck camper then, and copied about 12 boxes full of papers that Walter Parsons saved. And he was the gentleman that defended the 10, but it ended up being 5 who were court-martialed for mutiny. So all of that information, the maps that he had, the regimental location, where they were, what they did, decisions that were made, memos, and the court-martial transcript, we got it in National Archives in St. Louis. So to answers, I know I've jumped around a lot, but that is a shorthand version of 10 years of research that I
Wow.
have. So, and we always, if there was something down over here, we'd go there, or we'd travel to a little town to find the family members. We traveled, for instance, to Hickory, North Carolina, and found a family member at Thad Bryce and his son Fred and Bonnie, and spent the whole afternoon at their house talking about his father. So does that
Yeah.
answer your question about
Yeah.
research?
The research is amazing. It's really amazing to hear you talk about it. It sounds like you had fun doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I wish my dad was alive. I could have sat and talked to him about his time with the 93rd, but I didn't. Daughters don't ask their fathers about what they did in the war. So
Kids don't ask their parents enough of anything, actually, until it's too
Yes.
late, and then you realize, oops, should have talked about this.
So I had really enjoyed your book, and I learned so much more about, well, just the military and World War II history. But when I read the title and Lynn sort of talked about what it was about, I thought, well, this is going to be kind of dry maybe, but you kept it it kept it like you just kept want to read. I mean, the writing was so good. It just kept you into it and kept you, I was just amazed at how enticing
That was
the
my
whole book
husband
was.
did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We both wrote the first one, and then he literally wrote the other one, because I had to get all this research in line, and because he didn't do any research. So I had to tell him, okay, this happened next, and this is the important thing that we need to write about now. And why did they feel that a court-martial was necessary, and things like that. We stopped off at the JAG school, the where they train military attorneys in Charlottesville, Virginia, and talked to the head of the library on the phone there. They wouldn't let us in. But the issue with the trial was they used it as a form of discipline, so the rest of the blacks would fall in line, so, and not buck the system, so to speak. But the 97th had the worst time ever because in the Tanana Valley, the temperatures decreased. I think they were down almost to 50, 60, 70 below zero during the winter. And the 97th did not have enough clothing at all for the winter. And they also did not have enough housing. And I blame Robinson for this because there were Company A built their own log cabins. Company B may have had a few barracks. Food was difficult. The Thompson Pass was closed, and so they had a difficult time getting food because it had to come down from Fairbanks. And some of the other areas, they stayed in shacks and sheds that the civilians had. The civilians had left; they went home, and they survived the winter, literally sharing clothes, sharing their sleeping bags, just paying attention, make sure their noses weren't white. Nobody had any frostbite. I don't know how they survived. Mary Hansen, the Roadhouse with Mary Hansen and her husband. There was Company D, I think it is, that was there. And she remembers the soldiers and how their skin showed through the torn fatigues. And they gave them small things, candy, toothbrush, and food that they could spare in trying to keep them alive and warm. And you talk to some of the people at Delta about that. And I can't remember her name. She came up to me at the University of Anchorage and said, "Oh, we saved some of those men. We took care of some of those men during that time." So it's just amazing the poor behavior by the whites and the racial prejudice that was present in all of the regiments, and the myths that they had tails, or the myths that they, since they couldn't read or write, they were stupid, they couldn't operate heavy equipment. It was just very, very difficult for them, totally there.
Yeah, that treatment of the 97th was just absolutely appalling. And how did you find out the information where the white soldiers had better housing and a lot of the black soldiers were in fabric tents during the winter?
Oh, well, not during the winter. The white soldiers did not have a lot of housing. The whole entire living situation for the entire regiment, both white and black, was very, very poor. And how I found out about it were letters that Captain Parsons wrote to his wife. He was married, he had 5 children, and he told his wife that it was so cold they had to move underground where they stored the food. So he moved the officers down there, but yet the barracks up for Company F, which he was the captain, all they had is wood and tar paper, and they would go out and cut frozen logs, use explosive cord to do that, and to try to burn and keep the tents or shelters, whatever they were made out of, warm. What's interesting is the 95th during the winter was up at Summit Lake. Do you know where Summit Lake is down south? That's about a 3,500 elevation. They were up there building repeater stations and barracks for the Signal Corps and the truckers and things like that. And they lived in tents. And some of them had 2 sleeping bags and used 2 sleeping bags, one enveloped into the other to keep warm. And they had fires in their Sibley stoves or oil can stoves, whatever it was. Well, one of the tents caught on fire and 3 of the soldiers were burned. One almost died. But this was a situation that nobody really cared about. When they investigated it, they just said, well, they must have knocked over one of their candles or something to start the fire. But a lot of the well-being and health or treatment of the blacks was beyond understanding. I hate to say what I really feel about it. One of the, I think it was Matt Hickman, who is a journalist for one of the newspapers in Anchorage, asked me why was why are you so passionate about it? I said, I am a nurse practitioner. I treat everybody the same. I treat them in their illness, no matter what color. And for the military, the army, the white army, to treat these black soldiers the way they did is wrong. It's just wrong. It's abominable. So that's my passion.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
You
The
know,
book?
I was curious how available your book was in the state of Alaska, and I went to our public library site, and right now I don't remember which title I was looking for, but nothing located here. But there were a number of copies around the state, including the state library, but a lot of them are in Alaska collections, and they aren't available for circulation, and that kind of disturbed me a little bit that there wasn't better availability.
For
Now,
a different race?
yeah, the different race, my friend Lynn gave me, and I have that, but I think maybe I was looking up the Fought the Road one, and I just thought, well,
We Fought the Road, Epicenter Press, which was Lael Morgan's publishing company, published that. And then we published A Different Race through Ingram Sparks, and you can look them up online. And your library or whatever, your organization can order through Ingram Sparks these copies. They print them on demand. And the reason we had to go there is because nobody was publishing books during the COVID part. We finished this book during COVID. So, but Epicenter Press, you can call them, say, hey, we need some books up here, or Barnes and Noble can order from Ingram Sparks. It's just being a small publisher or being someone who doesn't have a huge platform. Like some of the celebrities, they write a book and then these publishing houses will then print, and it's a lot easier to get those kind of books. I lost you guys.
no,
There you go.
I see you.
I got the two books off of Amazon, but I think Barnes and Noble could have ordered them too. Have
Yes.
you tried to get the books into the museum, university's museum? Because to me, this is one
Yes.
that maybe should go in their book. Is it up? Is it up
Yes.
there? Or?
Well,
Okay.
Clark Milne, Milne, was with Ollie, said that they have the books at the University of Fairbanks in Fairbanks. I don't know about University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and I don't know about the University of Alaska in Anchorage. But yeah, they have the books, and I don't know how many, but their library has books there.
Or the museum might.
Yeah, does the bookstore at the or does the museum store have your book for sale? That
I don't
Museum
know.
of the North. Okay.
I would
So,
imagine.
but Epicenter Press is for We Fought the Road, and Ingram Sparks is for A Different Race. So, but the Alaska Highway was essentially built in 8 months. That's how fast they built that. It's called the Pioneer Road, the Tote Road. You talked about corduroy. They corduroyed a lot of the road because of the muskeg and permafrost, laying logs horizontally and putting dirt and gravel and then watching them sink, and then lay another layer of logs to do that. The equipment, the D8 bulldozers, I guarantee you, if somebody did a search underground of how many of those are still underground and buried because of the muskeg and permafrost. I know of one up at Devil Swamp, which is near Guanja Lake. That's like that is buried there. They called it Pollock's Graveyard. It's with my dad, but it was very difficult in the cold. It was also difficult in the summer with the mosquitoes and the gnats and the temperatures, and difficult to get food through them, both during the summer and especially during the winter. I love Captain Parsons' comment. He was the last company on the line to receive food, and some of his men were sick, so he kept asking for a medic to come down, and we need food. We only have 3 days of food. And finally, at the end of 3 days, and he wrote these little messages on these yellow papers, and we have all these messages, but he says, you know, either send food or send casket to the where they were. So there are just so many stories. And the story of the 95th building Sicanee Chief River Bridge, Company A bet their entire paycheck for that month that they would get the bridge built in less than 4 days, and they did. So they celebrated it, and even General O'Connor, who was the racist to the core, gave credit to them for building that bridge. And that's one issue there. The 95th, it was a Black regiment. They had a lot more training than any other Black regiment. And the other thing with the 95th I found is a lot more of them had high school and college education. A lot of them did. And so they were very, very smart, knew how to operate the machinery. And the 341st, which was a white regiment that was at Fort St. John at Charlie Lake, they were just brand new, and they didn't know how to build the roads. They were made from 2 other companies, a cadre of men. So, and what did O'Connor do? He took away the Blacks' equipment and gave it to the 341st. So here are these Black soldiers using shovels. I think they had 2 bulldozers, 1 grader, and maybe a deuce and a half to carry things away. But they built parts of the highway with very little equipment. A lot of them used Leonard Larkins. Leonard Larkins from Company A. That man is 103 years old, and he still lives in Louisiana. And I found him and talked to him, and he was private. And he remembers using the explosive cords to knock trees down. He remembers by hand they would remove brush, and they didn't have chainsaws. They used band saws. They had axes. They had shovels. They had wheelbarrows. And that's what he used. He didn't drive a bulldozer. He didn't drive a truck. This is what he did. But he's still alive today. The only one I know of that's still alive today of the veterans.
I'm kind of curious, Christine, about I was trying to keep track of how much of this road building was in the state of Alaska and how much was in Canada. I think it was happening both places, but I sort of lost track of that piece.
The highway started at Dawson Creek in Canada and ended in Delta, Alaska. So the majority of the highway is in Canada.
That our soldiers built.
Yes. That the United States military built this highway because of the fear of what they thought the Japanese soldiers would be able to do. And they did. They attacked at Dutch Harbor, and they landed in Attu and Kiska. So,
But then in a different race, because they had to get to where the Alaska Highway was, you have that whole part where from Valdez going over to like Tok, and that they have to get what would basically go through what we call the Tok cutoff now.
that's
I mean, and
exactly
that was
how it
just
got built.
horrendous. Yeah, it was
Yes.
just horrendous getting through that. And I don't think, I got the impression, maybe I was wrong, that if the white commander had not given a lot of leeway to those Black soldiers, to let them kind of do what they knew how to do, and they did seem to know what they were doing, it would not have made it. I don't
No.
know, maybe I was.
No, you were right, because General Hogue was very upset with Whipple because he only made about 50 miles of highway, and there was a timetable to get this done. And so he fired and then put Colonel Robinson in charge. Now, Colonel Robinson was a National Guard soldier, but his family ran a construction company. So he told Captain Parsons, he says, I'm going to give you all the men to do the handwork, building the culverts, building the ditches, so forth and so on, and maybe a D7 bulldozer, a few trucks and things like that. So a normal company was about 200 men. Well, Captain Parson had over 500 men to take care of while those that operated the big guns, you know, the graders, the D8 bulldozers and things like that, pulled and pushed forward and crossed the Tanana River to go to the town of Tok. And it was the Tok cutoff. The hardest part was Mentasta Pass. That was Abercrombie had a hard time when he rode in the horse trail, and they couldn't find the horse trail that Abercrombie used. And when you reach the moraine at Mentasta Pass, you know, can you imagine, not just from Slana River and the sand hills, where there was a bulldozer and all of a sudden the bulldozer starts going off the side of the hill, or you have to turn it a certain way to jack it up to replace the track that may fall off. But on Mentasta Pass, the moraine is sharp. So they got cut, the tracks came off. It was just very, very hard for them to even get over that. So I wish I could have seen Mentasta Pass, but I was not able to get down there. There was trying to think. As we drove through the Tok cutoff, off to the left, there was a small First Nations village. And we took a risk, you know, because they're very private people. So we drove down there and got out and started talking to people, and they walk to Mentasta Lake, but it's cut off, so you can't drive there. But they walk and they fish down there, but they wouldn't tell us how to get there. So I wanted to see where the soldiers drove their bulldozers. But anyway, it's like Carcross. It took forever for me to find the cemetery, to find the Polly, the bird, the parrot that lived in Carcross Hotel, that spit on the floor and talked. I mean, the bird, I think it was 200 years old. It was alive during the gold rush. And the hotel, it would be in the cage. I wanted to see that. Or Johnny Johns, you know, with help with the surveying of the 93rd. And essentially, Nellie, what is her name? One of the First Nations, Klingon, we talked to, said that Johnny Johns made the route of the highway because he wanted the route to go by his favorite fishing places. And it crawled right down there. And I cannot remember that. She's passed too. She was 6 years old when the black soldiers arrived in Carcross. And she said, Mom, there's these black white men here or something like that. And she remembers a soldier playing the piano, and they dragged the piano out from the hotel. And I'm listening to this woman, her name will come to me, I swear. The woman tell the story of all the unusual music. And my husband said, well, what was he playing? And she says, and he said, can you remember? Oh yes, she was playing Pistol Packin' Mama on that piano in that hotel. It was something to behold for this 6-year-old girl. Ida Calmagain. I met Ida Calmagain at the Klingon celebration in Teslin on our second trip up there. That was fascinating. Ida with Pearl Keenan and Emma Shorty, it's amazing, I remember these names, were all sitting up front at this Klingon celebration. And some people did not like my husband and I sitting there, but Ida took a piece of paper and she put it in a chair, and she says, you come back here and you sit right here. And we got served dinner first with the elders. And one of the nieces of Pearl Keenan said, do you understand what an elder means? And I said, oh, yes, I do. So talking to her and dealing with her, she wasn't angry, but she was disappointed that we sat with the elders because we were not supposed to be part of the elders. But I felt very privileged. And I talked to Emma Shorty more than Pearl. Pearl had diabetes. She have difficulty seeing, difficulty hearing, but I talked to Emma Shorty. She was 6 years old when they put her in one of those Catholic orphanages that they mistreated these First Nations. So she remembered that. And she had tuberculosis. She only had one lung. And I had a Calmagain. Her father would not allow the mounted police to take her to one of these schools. So they lived out on the land. She said, we lived out on the land. And this was during the highway, all during the highway.
Hmm.
So there's a lot to be said. I wish I had time to research how it impacted the First Nations in not only the Tlingits, the Athabascans, but all Eskimo, everything there, as they had developed their land, their routes of fishing, their routes of hunting, the caribou, things like that, their pattern of practice of living and how they lived and moved around Alaska and Canada, and how the military just sort of came in with bulldozers and pushed them out of their way. I know, I'm trying to think. Over Thompson, Gulkana. There was a little town of First Nations where they literally had to move them out in order to accommodate some of the Duesenberg civilians that were working on that part of the highway as well. So many stories. Like,
What was the supply chain? How did supplies get to these folks? Was it from shipped up to Valdez and then
there was
over
a ship
to-
up to Valdez. The port of Valdez brought all the supplies in for both the civilian PRA and the 97th until October when Thompson Pass closed again. And then they had to get them from Fairbanks, and they also had to get them from Whitehorse. Now, to me, the biggest port that supplied the most regiments, 3 and 4 regiments, was Skagway that came in. And you know that tide goes in and out. I think it changes in 25 feet. So they had to build another dock for all these ships to come up there. And there was a train, and then a train battalion came and also added more cars to carry the heavy equipment, the dozers, everything, tents, blankets, food, everything across. And then it all went through Carcross and onto Whitehorse. And then from Whitehorse, it went down Teslin River. And so the 97th and the PRA up there, most of their supplies were coming through Valdez. Well, one of the Richardson Highway was built, if you would call that. It was a narrow highway prior to the time that the regiment arrived. And then Dawson Creek was another. It was huge. They had the National Alberta Railroad. So the railroad came from the States and up through Dawson Creek in order to supply that. And toward the end of building the highway, Dawson Creek had more storage facilities, a warehouse. They put in sewer lines, water tanks. Military did a lot of things to help that town in order to accommodate their men. So, but Skagway was the biggest port of supplies, in my opinion, for things to come through. And steamboats, flat bottom boats would take them. Actually, it was up the river, so Teslin River. Morley Bay was where the 93rd and the 340th had their equipment and supplies and repair shop, things like that. Of course, you always had little shops, like Jake's Corner had a little shop that would be able to fix some of the equipment. So it was. Well, this looks like the good place to put a couple tents so we can put a couple mechanics, and we did that. All through the highway, food, that everybody got tired of Spam. They threw so many Spam sandwiches on the highway, you could pave it with it. But they all went hunting. They'd have bear meat, which was very strong, or caribou or meat, and fish. They all would go out fishing and to feed some of the military. So there, some of the supplies. So I have a picture of Carcross with tires and boxes of rations, just totally almost obliterating the little church behind it, that particular train depot, which was very, very small, all of a sudden became very, very big because supplies came up through that town. That and Tagish.
I wanted to mention a couple locations in Fairbanks that might also should carry your book. One is the Bear Gallery, which has a small book store there and other things. And probably wouldn't sell many there, but I found some books there that I didn't see anywhere else, sort of like your books. And then the Public Lands Information Center, a lot of books go through there, and a lot of people driving up the Alcan Highway go in there. I think your book would sell pretty well there. So those are two places if whoever,
I would, I'm not in control of that. I tell people this. Phil Garrett, who is Epicenter Press and We Fought the Road, has a much better feel of where these books should be delivered. But Ingram Sparks is just a direct publishing company that will publish the books. If you want 12 books, they'll print them out and they'll get them to you. But that has to come through the facility, whether a museum says, oh yes, that'd be a good idea. So it's like word of mouth. Listen, I read this, you ought to put this here, you can sell it, so forth and so on. Why don't you try 5 to 10 copies? You know, you don't have to get all, you know, a 24 box of 24, but that way they might get more books. We Fought the Road sells very well, and my royalty checks, I don't get paid much, but I get more royalty checks for We Fought the Road. A Different Race I don't, because we made Little Lands in Publishing as our publishing company because nobody would publish our book and we had to get it out. And then people would say, how do we get the book? Well, you tell your library or your archive or wherever, your organization, Home for the Aging, that organization, please order 5 to 10 copies and they'll get it to you. But you can look up Ingram Sparks, INGRAMSPARKS on the internet and ask for that particular book. They have the rights. I signed a contract to publish it, and they also have the Booker numbers to do that. So that's, and when I get finished with my book that I'm doing now about the flight nurses in Africa and Italy, I'm going to put that through Ingram Sparks as well. And I will get copies. I find sometimes copies that I give out, people by word of mouth will say, go find this book or something like that. But that's it. Your libraries, your museums, anybody that has reading books or things like that, please order. Barnes and Noble, please order 5 books, things like that. So that's how I have no control over that anymore. So.
Christine, I have a question, and that is,
Yes.
I had heard that the Alaska Highway was built in a zigzag fashion to prevent the Japanese from strafing a whole long section of the road with the equipment coming up. Is that a true thing that I heard, or what?
I kind of doubt it, because if you can imagine the highway. Did I lose you guys? The highway, they had a difficult time finding surface road that didn't involve a lot of muskeg or permafrost. So it was very irregular and probably zigzaggy, but wasn't purposefully done like ships on sea go in a zigzag pattern to prevent bombing. So they built the road where there was least resistance, and they could grade it, put the culverts down, things like that.
Okay,
But it was hard, and knocking the trees down. If the trees came down, that's fine. and they also learned what trees grew in muskeg and what to leave those alone, and vegetation in muskeg. And I said, well, maybe we ought to go over here in another direction. So, but nobody bombed. No Japanese plane came to mainland Alaska or Canada. Japanese came to Dutch Harbor, Kiska, and Attu. And then we, through the Lend-Lease program, there were a lot of Russian pilots and female pilots flying out of Anchorage and Fairbanks, Ladfield, to go to Russia through the Lend-Lease program. So.
Right.
Does that help? It's
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were the Japanese enemies, and then there were the Russians friends. So we were preventing one, but facilitating another. So it was a
exactly.
fascinating time in Alaska's history.
Yes, a lot of stuff. Yes. Then you have the Canola Project. Quinton Taylor from blackpast.org, he says, why don't you write about it, the Canola Project, or how come that's not included in your book? I said, that's a separate project and a separate book, and it's a separate thing that we didn't have time to research, but that building the oil fields up there. So yes. Yes.
But
What
now
is the book you're working? Go ahead, Mary.
well, I was just wanted to know a little bit more about the next book you're working on. I don't know if we have to wrap up by 5, or what's our plan here, Lynn?
We should probably wrap up by 5, but we can stay on a few more minutes. It's later, of course, for Chris, but
No, I'm fine. I told my husband long before we finished a different race that I wanted to write. I was a nurse practitioner in the emergency room, and I wanted to write a story about some of the nurses through World War II. And so going back and researching a lot of these books written about nurses in World War II, they write a lot about nurses in evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, so forth and so on. But very few books have been written about flight nurses. So I started researching. It took me about a year and a half to get enough information. And then I had to look up these women. And then I had to find several women that I had more information than others. And so it's the 802 squadron. So flight nurses didn't come into being into the U.S. Army Air Corps until 1942, when they went to Bowman Field to train, except they pulled them away from their training and shipped them to Africa during the invasion torch, and then to fly these men. These women were in their 20s and 30s, and they got on C-47 aircraft, their cargo planes, and they had 18 to 20 patients, and they were racked on either side of the plane. And they had no physician. They took care of these patients, flew them back to hospitals. And because that type of evacuation, many soldiers survived. So they were in North Africa, and then they went to Sicily, and then on to Italy. So it's a story of them, 25 people, and some of their adventures. And it will end when Aleda Lutz dies in a plane crash. So that's how I want to end my book. But I've got about 150 pages. It's a novel, because I was not able to go to the archives to research some of these things. So I'm writing dialogue, which is very difficult for me. I have never written a novel before. So just taking my time here. My husband's been dead for 2 years, and so I had a real tough time for these 2 years, and I'm getting back to normal now. So I will do that. Finish the book hopefully this year.
you said there were only 25 nurses?
In this squadron.
Hmm.
Yes. But they had different squadrons. They had flight nurses in the Pacific. They had flight nurses in China and Burma, each with fascinating stories. But I think of my mother, who during World War II, who wanted to be a dress designer in her 20s. And I think of her and I said, how did some of those women decide to get on an airplane? You know, like Amelia Earhart, or during that time, you know, how did these women decide I want to be a pilot, or I want to fly with 18 wounded soldiers on an airplane? Just, it's amazing to me.
So the
The-
women
the-
were pilots and nurses, right?
Some of them were pilots and nurses. All of them were nurses, but they wanted to get on the plane, a flight nurse. They wanted that experience. I cannot imagine. I mean, the C-47 is a single engine plane. No, it's a double engine plane. Sorry. And it was so creaky and it twisted. The wings twisted. They had to fly at 3,000 feet because of hypoxia. They didn't have any markings, and sometimes they were shot at. And so it's just amazing to me that women want to get on a plane with 18 wounded soldiers and help them. So that's what I'm doing.
Well, I just want to say, I don't know how much longer we have. I just want to say, Christine, thank you for what you do. Your research is fascinating and it's important. These are stories that we need to tell. So you're
Yes.
doing it. You're doing it. You're really wonderful to be doing these things. So thank you.
Thank you. I love to write.
Yeah, I want to say too, Christine, thanks for giving this presentation to us. And I hope that these books will start to help Black Americans get more recognition for all the contributions they did
Yes.
for World War II, especially obviously on the highway. Living up here, I just didn't realize how they'd contributed to that road and how poorly they were treated. This is all new to me. And yeah, hopefully your work can help change this.
Yeah. Well, A.L. Morgan, are you familiar with her?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, she died in July, but she did a lot of work for the Black regiments and even came back to the States and worked with Colin Powell and a reunion at Florida A&M. That's it, Florida A&M University, which is a Black university. So she started that, and then there's Jean Pollard. She's still living. Matter of fact, Jean tried to call me last time. I got to call her, and she's in Anchorage, and she runs the highway project. And she and Lael were really critical in getting this out. And Lael, thank God, while she was alive, was she gave us a master class how to write a book, and that was We Fought the Road. She helped us get that done. She was beyond helpful. I miss her.
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, are there any other questions, comments? We certainly thank you very much. Elizabeth, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I knew Lael and also a good friend who was her researcher, Rosalie Lecuyer. We lost her a couple of years ago. But they did really Trojan work in
Yes.
going around and collecting the information and organizing it. And
Yes.
there are quite a number of people of my acquaintance in this town for whom these are the stories that their uncles told them
Yes.
before the families moved to Alaska. And there was several of my friends, but thank you so much.